600 girls that have died following this vaccine. So if we look at the truth of this vaccine, we see it's a very dangerous vaccine. Now, one of the things about it is its adjuvant, that is the immune stimulating part of the vaccine. It contains twice as much brain damaging aluminum as other vaccines. And so that would explain why we're seeing so much problem with this particular vaccine. But the problem is the whole thing is predicated on an enormous deception. And that's the idea that, and they're telling these girls in the doctor's office that if your daughter gets an HPV infection, she's going to develop cervical cancer and probably die from it. Well, if you look at the scientific information, that's not true at all. What we actually see is that death from cervical cancer is extremely rare, and that the majority of women who are HPV infected are not going to develop cervical cancer. And those that do, this extremely small percent, about 1% of all women who develop cervical cancer, most of them are going to occur when they're age 50 and above. So this 11-year-old girl that they want to vaccinate, 20-year-old girl, is not in any real danger until she's in her 50s. If we look at the accepted statistics, 1% of women less than age 30 will develop cervical cancer. Now, that's 100 cases in the entire United States. Just 9% below age 40 will develop cervical cancer. 73% of cases occur in women that are above age 50. So we're talking about preventing a disorder that's extremely rare, that occurs mostly in women over age 50, and yet they want to vaccinate them when they're 11 years old. Well, they've even admitted the vaccine probably will not have any effectiveness at all after 5 years from the vaccine. So that means by the time the girl's 16 years old, the vaccine is useless. There's no evidence whatsoever that this vaccine prevents cervical cancer. There's little evidence that it even reduces HPV infection of the cervix, even though that's possible. We know that 90% of girls that get infected with HPV virus, it will clear by itself. In other words, they get the clearing and curing of the virus by itself without any treatment. And that only 10% is the virus persistent, and only a small percentage of that 10% will ever develop cervical cancer. And again, it's after age 50 or around that age. So what's being told is an enormous lie that we're preventing death from cervical cancer by this vaccine, when none of those things seem to be true. It's not preventing the HPV that we've been led to believe. This vaccine was fast-tracked, went through approval within 6 months without adequate testing. It still has not been adequately tested. There's no evidence that prevents cervical cancer. And we know that there's a lot of other cofactors that HPV virus by itself, even HPV 16 type, by itself cannot produce cervical cancer. It has to have cofactors. These include smoking, exposure to long-term birth control pills, multiple sex partners, poor hygiene, poor diet. And we find, in fact, there's some excellent studies done that show if young women consume folate, folic acid, and vitamin B12, they reduce their incidence of HPV infection itself 74%, which far exceeds what we've seen with this vaccine, and it reduces the incidence of cervical cancer 70%. So here you have a simple way to prevent cervical cancer in these young girls without endangering them, because folic acid B12 certainly doesn't kill 68 young women, or that's the higher number that we discussed. Now, if you want to make something mandatory, why don't you make it mandatory that all young girls take folic acid B12 and stop smoking? Because those are the leading causes of cervical cancer. And that's been proven time and again by numerous laboratories and numerous studies. And we know that this HPV vaccine only produces cervical cancer in the presence of significant folic acid B12 deficiency, and that smoking produces vitamin B12 folic acid deficiency. So the whole thing is predicated on a lie. It's there for nothing but producing sales for the vaccine manufacturer, the Merck Pharmaceutical Company, to sell these vaccines. They're secretly going around to state legislatures trying to get mandatory laws passed, like Governor Perry did. He accepted $5,000 each from 3 different pharmaceutical vaccine manufacturers. Over $377,000 that Merck Pharmaceutical put in the Governors Association of Texas for the good governor to mandate this vaccine. And there was no evidence that it needed to be mandated. So this whole thing is just a farce, but it's a dangerous farce because they're destroying the lives of these young girls. Many of these girls are having repeated seizures. They're crippled by arthritis. They're having cognitive problems, cannot remember, cannot learn. They're having to drop out of their sports events. They're having to have a lot of difficulty with their schooling. And this is all being covered up, not discussed by the media. And mothers need to know, start asking some serious questions. And what they'll find out is many of these physicians know absolutely nothing about HPV infection. They know nothing about cervical cancer and the relationship to HPV vaccinations.
The other question is, how much influence does the big pharma industry have over politics? Why are we seeing a wave of backlash against Michelle Bachmann, a political candidate's comments that HPV causes, quote, retardation, and saying there's no data when there's all the incidence reports we've just talked about? Are they playing semantical games with the definition of retardation, or are they simply denying that this is a dangerous vaccine that was allowed to be pushed on a political level?
Well, it's all politics, and it's all profits for the pharmaceutical companies. And you realize the pharmaceutical companies are pumping tens of millions of dollars to these politicians, and Perry's a good example. He's been promised $50 million for his presidential bid by these pharmaceutical companies. He's gotten over $1.5 million funneled through backdoor for himself. And his chief of staff, in fact, has made sure that he's gotten the influence of Merck Pharmaceutical throughout the whole political structure. So, yes, this is pure politics, but it's being paid for by the pharmaceutical companies big time. They're huge money. They have huge influence. We're talking about billions of dollars in the sales of these vaccines if they're made mandatory. Now, you'll notice every time these pharmaceutical company reps or these politicians or the CDC talks about the high death rate from cervical cancer, they never talk about in the United States. It's always in the world. Well, we know in undeveloped third world nations, cervical cancer is a killer because they don't get pap smears. They have poor hygiene. They have poor dietary intake. They have immune deficiencies. And so, of course, they have it. But in the United States, it's extremely rare, very rare, easily controlled, 100% cure rate of the early detected cervical cancer, 100% cure rate. And we know that just by supplying a few vitamins, you can dramatically reduce the incidence of infection by HPV and cervical cancer, and even that many of these cases of the dysplasia of the cervix, that is, the precancerous changes, will revert back to normal in the presence of giving folic acid and vitamin B12. Now, all of this is well demonstrated. But they cover this up because they're trying to sell vaccines, and the politicians want these donations from these pharmaceutical companies for their political careers.
Now, we've seen a lot of the victims go on television. There's been a lot of CBS reports and other things about the paralysis and the seizures that have happened. What about the face of those victims? Why is everything focused on Rick Perry, who's running for higher office, and how he's now sorry all these years later about mandating this vaccine, which of course had effects in other states, other parts of the world?
Well, again, this is what we're saying is all of these victims have no voice. The media really doesn't want to talk to them because pharmaceutical companies advertise heavily on all the major media.